Um, Ready, Caroline? Jeff?
Coffee?
Sure.
Cream?
Sure. What then, as I would say? I had the funniest book conversation this week with the guy who wrote a book called Old Jewish Men's Guide to Eating, Sleeping, and Futzing Around. And it was very, very funny. How to get along well in this fakakta world. It was a very evening of laughter. We could use it. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so let's dive in to the story of Korach and some of its meanings and have a conversation. I think it's an amazing story just to think about offhand, like just to begin with, like that a story of rebellion in the Torah, a story of rebellion actually after last week's rebellion. It's kind of a double rebellion from last week with the spies, and then now with Korach, and the meanings that the tradition has given to it. And I think that to some degree, Korach is always a Rorschach test of sorts. You know, it's kind of like depending on where you are ideologically, someone is always a Korach, right, relative to your to your authority, whatever it might be, if somebody is standing up to it. But we can take a look at Korach and see some of the, and I'll just have a conversation about it, and yeah, apply it if we can also. Cool, right? Okay. Vayikach Korach, source number one. Vayikach Korach, ben Yitzhar, ben Kehat, ben Levi, Vedatan v'Aviram b'nei Eliyav, ve'on ben Pelet b'nei Reuven. Okay. Not clear. I mean, just when we read this, the first verse in chapter 16 of the book of Numbers, Vayikach Korach. It's a very strange. We'll see in a second that phrase is a very strange phrase, and he took, because just from a purely linguistic angle, to take something, you then have to say the object that you take. Vayikach. Strange. It's a strange moment if you're reading the text. I mean, we all know what it means on some level. Like he took these people, but what does it mean more deeply? The tradition will try to understand. Good morning. And then we have a list of names, like his lineage. Like the first thing we know about Korach is that he's the son of Yitzhar and the son of Kehat, and that he's a son ultimately of Levi. A woman last night at the Y after services came over to me. She said, "Rabbi, how do I determine what Shevet, what tribe I'm from? I want to know where I'm from, what tribe I'm from." I said, "We lost that. We don't really know." Like,
Vibe.
What?
Vibe.
Yeah, vibe. It's like a tribe vibe. You have to know. You just vibe it. I'm from Yisachar, Zavulun, but we don't know. But then I said, well, why are you asking? She said, because my father, on his tombstone, says that he's a Levite. I said, oh, so you're from, that's the only tribe that we know, right? The Levite tribe, the Kohanim Levites. Like, we even with that, we don't really know, frankly. There were some who tried to do studies on the lineage and the hereditary, especially in the priestly. We have people who are called Peretz, or really not, or Katz, which is Kohen Tzedek, righteous priest, or Khan, or Rappaport. We have these names, but like generally speaking, we don't really know the tribe. But here the tribe matters because it's mentioned, and not only is it mentioned here, but it's also mentioned with these two other characters, Datan and Aviram, who are the sons of Eliyav, right? So the sons of Eliyav actually and then On ben Pelet. On ben Pelet is the third of the characters, On ben Pelet, and they are Bnei Reuven. They're all Reubenites. So we have a Levite, and then we have a group of 3 Reubenites, right? That's the first opening verse. So with our exegetical detective, which is the name it should be the name of a blog, Exegetical Detective. So we can see that maybe there's something about the fact that they are from a particular tribe, which matters.
Which
Yes.
is the music, I forgot, which is the tribe which is most musical?
Most musical, the Levites.
Oh, okay. So it seems like a lot of us come from.
Yeah, a lot of us come from Levites, the musical ones. All of us have a spiritual lineage.
It seems to me.
Like, hey, you're a Levite. Yeah, to the Beatles, a bunch of Levites. The Rolling Stones, a bunch of Levites.
Go by the instinct. That's what my instinct.
That's your instinct? Okay, good. Last night, yeah. I'm just, ich bin a Pasha Yid, and Levites. Maybe we have all of us have a shtickle Levite in us if we like to harmonize. Okay. All right. So verse 2, Vayakumu lifnei Moshe. They stood up in front of Moshe. Okay. And then Vayakumu, they rose up against him. They stood in front of him. All right. V'anashim ibnei Yisrael chamishim u'masayim nisei eidah kriyei moed anshe Shem. And people from the children of Israel, 50 and 200, so 250 of them, not just your average, but Nisi'ei Eidah, like the chieftains or the princes of the community, Kriyei Moed, right? Those who appoint the times, like those who call out the chosen men in the assembly, but really, like Kriyei Moed is an interesting phrase, those who proclaim, the proclaimers of the meetings, the proclaimers right, those who are in charge, the assemblymen, they're all assemblymen, the assembly. Anshe Shem, men of repute, or men of name, right, of great name. Now this should remind us, of course, of last week's Parsha, because the spies, all of them were similarly chosen, and the Torah goes out of its way to tell us how good their pedigree was. Okay? And now, Vayikalu al Moshe. And now not only do they stand before Moshe, but they congregate around him. And then they add Aaron, Al Aaron, Vayomru Alehem. So now they're not just standing before Moshe, but they're also congregating around him, combining. Vayomru Alehem, and they say to them, Rav Lachem. And they say to them, Rav Lachem. What does that mean? Rav Lachem?
Too much.
Too much. You have Rav means here harbe, like you're temidain, too much. Ki chol ha'edah kulam kidoshim. Ki chol ha'edah kulam kidoshim. The whole Eidah, and the word Eidah here is also, this is the second time it's being used. Eidah is like a community, and Eidah is a congregation. They're all holy. Kulam kidoshim, uvetocham Adonai, and God is in their midst. Madua titnasu al kahal Adonai. Why do you raise yourselves up above the congregation of God? That's also like not just the kahal, but the kahal Adonai, the congregation of God. Now, what's interesting linguistically also here is a couple of things just to note. The Torah goes out of its way to describe these people in verse 2 as Nisi'ei Ha'edah. Those who are the Nisi'im are those who have been elevated. The same word is being used in their accusation against Moshe and Aaron. Like they already have been described with the general, like the title of Nisi'im. And then Nisi, which is to be an elevated one, is the very verb used. Why are you elevating yourselves? Right? They've already been described as elevated themselves. The one who are accusing are already elevated. And now they say to Moshe and Aaron, why are you elevated? But they're also elevated. They don't say, why are we elevated? They don't say, why all of us have been chosen. We're like Nisi'im, we're elevated. But you, Moshe and Aaron, you have uniquely been elevated, right? So that's A, in terms of the language, right? Verse 2 and verse 3. And in verse 3, what's remarkable is it begins with them congregating, the word congregation at Kihila, Vayakilu, they congregate around Moshe, right, and Aaron. But at the end of the verse, they're saying, why are you elevated above the Kahal, the congregation of God? They've congregated, but then they say there's a Kihila, another Kihila called the Kihila of God. right? But wait a second, aren't you? What's going on here? It's very confusing, even in the language, right? The language itself is already displaying that the accusations and the narrative that's being spun about Moshe and Aaron's leadership is something that's already in them as well, and they're not interrogating themselves, just interrogating Moshe and Aaron. Just saying that. I mean, okay, so let's stop there for a second. Thoughts? What's going on here? And you don't have to have thoughts. We're going to leave. We have Chitzkuni coming up. He's on deck. Yeah, Wendy? Envy. So is there envy going on here? Okay. Who's Korach, by the way?
Moshe's cousin.
How do we know that?
Diane told us.
Oh, Diane told you. That's good. That's a good one. Diane told us. It's true. I'm sure Diane told you. Rabbi Koleses is, But let's just imagine we can take a step without Rabbi Koleses for a moment. Like, how do we know this without, because they are the children of Levi, right? Who is Moshe? Moshe is from the tribe of Levi, right? In the beginning of chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vaytikach et, right? Isha mi beit Levi. So Moshe is a Levite. His father was a Levite. His mother, goes all the way back. And so, of course, Korach is in the family. So there's something going on here with Korach and his accusation. And it's also interesting, of course, because of all the tribes who have been elevated, of course, Levi is elevated and singled out. So Korach has a little skin in the game. He has a little, Jay, go ahead, brother.
You pointed out language, and I'm just struck by the verbs. They're very energetic action verbs. Vayikach, vayikumu, vayikahu. There's a lot of energy there.
Yeah, these guys are real. There's something about this situation that is energizing Korach and his friends. They're really passionate about this claim, right? This claim they're throwing down a gauntlet in front of Moses, and then Aaron too. And they're passionate. They're energetic. They see an opening. They see a possibility. Right? We had an experience of this week in New York City, a very passionate, a very passionate, exciting person who come forward and to rail against the establishment and to try to level the playing field and make a claim about hierarchy and heterarchy and flattening and so on. So we know there's a lot of energy here, right? He's got a campaign going. And the campaign begins against Moshe. I see the two hands. It begins against Moshe, and then all of a sudden he schleps Aaron in. Like what did Aaron, is it the whole establishment? Is it just Moshe? It seems like it's Moshe, and then, right? And the irony, of course, as Jay pointed out, is that the energy of Korach is so overwhelming, and yet Korach is a part of the establishment that he seems to be critiquing. And is it genuine? Is he trying to muscle his way in? He say I'm part of the establishment, but I really want more. He says the claim against Moshe and Aaron is Rab Lachem, you have too much, you've taken too much upon yourselves. I don't have here, the response from Moshe later on is he uses the exact same phrase in response to Korah. He says, wait a second, you guys are elevated. Rav Lachem, you have too much, it's a chutzpah. Okay, yeah.
I'm going to quote Sachs, I read it last night.
Quote Rabbi Sachs, why not?
So the first half, for the whole community is holy, it's a pretty good argument and probably something that needs to be continued to be talked about. The second half of it that you've raised yourself up is probably incorrect. That Moses was the humblest of all men, and that he was functioning as a leader, but he really wasn't trying to be a ruler.
Yeah. I mean, what is the claim? It's a strange claim, though. I mean, honestly, Rabbi Sachs, kvodo b'mkom hamunach, like giving him his due credit, but it's a strange claim. What does it have to do with leadership? Okay, so God is in the midst of all these people, and does that mean just because all of them have been imbued with holiness that each of them is leadership? What is the assumption of leadership that is pre-baked into this critique? Is his assumption of leadership that any leader who actually leads is arrogating to themselves greater levels of holiness? And also is Moshe the one who has been elevated? Did Moshe? I mean, he's his cousin. He should know that Moshe didn't want to be the leader. Like Moshe in the Torah is saying, you know what, God, no, thank you. I ran away. I'm not going back. Shlach na bi'ati shlach. Send somebody else, right? In fact, one of Moshe's greatest qualities, and one that most people who are born to lead don't have and struggle with, because if you are born to lead, often you know that you're born to lead. And then you see, wait a second, history says that people who know that they should lead are not always good leaders. And so then you struggle to say, oh, I shouldn't lead. But I should lead because I want to lead. But the fact that I want to lead is itself saying something about, the more, often you hear people saying, the person's the good leader if they never wanted to lead. And Moshe is a perfect example of that, right? You didn't want to lead. But what about if you're born and you know you want to lead? And you know from a very early age that you're called to leadership. Is being called to leadership and knowing that you're called to leadership in immediate disqualification of your leadership. You're not humble enough. And then you work on being falsely humble for 20 years before you finally decide that you're going to take up a mantle of leadership. I mean, it's just a funny accusation from Korach, given his status and given that he's not implicating himself, right? He should be saying, who made you, Levites and servants? We should all stop being that. We should make a rotation where everybody gets a chance to tell the people to go forward or to go backwards, right? It's a very funny claim of egalitarianism. Does egalitarianism mean that there's never somebody who is more characterologically appropriate for leadership without it becoming, right, a non-egalitarianism, right? Is that what egalitarianism means? So that's a question.
Well, the question, I think, point number one is whether or not we even need leadership. If we're all holy, if we're all prophets,
right?
And I think this argument to take to its conclusion is, is Jewish renewal? Are we kind of elevating ourselves to the point where we're saying we don't need you guys from 2,000 years ago to tell us how to deal with certain
This was the exact problem with Lubavitcher Rebbe when they chose him.
Yeah.
He was supposed to go, the other one, Gorari, was supposed to be
right.
the Rebbe. The whole community understood this was the real one.
Right.
How did they understand that?
Well,
it was instinctive.
Well, I'm going to respond, but first I want to go to Rachel. She was waiting patiently, and then I'll come back to this for a second. And then I see two people. Hold on. Okay, yes.
I am amazed at the lack of specific examples as to what Korah.
I'm so sorry. Could you please come forward and speak into the mic more so the people online can hear you? Thank you so much.
It's right next to you. Sorry, just pass it on. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I am amazed that there is no specific example that Korah gives as to what he thinks that he could add. And because Moses got the people together, Moses got the people out, Moses got the 10 Commandments, Moses can talk to God anytime Moses wants to. What is this big thing that Korah thinks is the next great leadership action? This is ridiculous. He is saying, gee, I wish I were as powerful as you. This is a childish feeling that all of us have, don't we? I wish I were so damn important and I'm interviewed on a daily basis, and nobody seems to be pointing this out. What the heck does this guy think is such a big deal that he needs to give advice?
And just to underscore a little bit more of your energy around this, and just that Korach, right, even in the model of everybody's a leader, he steps in and models leadership. Right? In other words, his claim is belied by the fact that he is the only one. If there is really a problem, leadership steps up and acknowledges. So like for him to then step into leadership and then deny leadership, or that some are called to leadership, is itself a kind of performative contradiction. Like he just steps up and he says like, oh, like we don't need leaders. Yeah, but you just showed why we need leaders. So like either his claim has legitimacy and validity, or it doesn't, and he undermines his own, right? His own argument is itself undermined by him bringing it. And so I want to actually move to Beth, if you could go ahead, and then Amy, I'm gonna put you on hold for a second. I want to see what the Chizkuni says about this moment. Go ahead, Beth.
Shabbat Shalom. I just wanted
Shabbat
to
Shalom.
point out that Moshe and Korah did not grow up together. So any knowledge that Korah has about Moshe is a very recent vintage, because they wouldn't have been rubbing shoulders for very
Right.
long. And
So
I also
therefore,
wanted to say in Korach's defense, there's a lot to be said for people who are willing to speak what at least they perceive as truth to someone in a position of power. We're seeing this all the time in our government right now, of this toadying around our current president. And it's like, any good boss wants people who point out what can't be seen. And so, on the one hand, he doesn't know that much about Moshe. And on the other hand, at least his intent is righteous, even if his motivation isn't necessarily sweet. Debarty.
okay, Shamati, I want to come back to that that potentially positive spin on Korach, because you'll see, depending on the rebels and in Jewish history, the exegetical angle they take is right very much refracted through how they perceive rebellion, how they perceive authoritarian, or like challenges to authority and so on. So let's look at the Chizkuni on the bottom of the page, and then we'll come back. Okay, so remember I said earlier that the word vayikach and Korach took is problematic grammatically because it doesn't say what he took. Usually when you have a vayikach and he took, it would say he took something, right? It doesn't say that, it just says that he took. Now Chizkuni, this commentator on the bottom of page 1, is in a long line of commentators who try to fill in the blank on what he took. So lekichat anashim, Korach acquired people. Right? In other words, we don't see what he took because it's actually the very thing is named in the end of the verse, which is he took Datan and Aviram, right? Those others who are named are the very objects of Korach's taking. He took them, right? He overtook them. He took them. He acquired people or sympathizers. Which people did he acquire specifically? Datan and Aviram, sons of Eliav, as well as On ben Pelet, members of the tribe of Reuven. And he says, who are other discontents. What were the discontents of the Reubenites? Right? I'm going to skip over the Vav connection here that he makes, okay? If you look at Ibn Ezra, Ibn Ezra says that he took them in public, not in private. There wasn't he literally was a very public thing. He didn't make a little, gathering that was every now and then would get together and say, hey, we're concerned about this. A very public affront to the authority of Moshe. Now, the Chizkuni mentions the discontents. What are the discontents of Reuben? Who are the Reubenites? So Reuben was the firstborn child of the first of the tribes, was Reuben, right? The first 4 children that Jacob has in order are Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Yehudah. Those are the first 4. Reuben lost his birthright as the eldest. Why? Because he acted like a complete incompetent leader in the Joseph narratives, right? He lost it radically, right? He first was unable to stand up to the other brothers. He kind of came up with a half-assed idea not to kill Joseph, and Judah was really the one who saved them. And then, of course, in the story where Jacob and Judah, Reuben also sleeps with, prior in the story, early in the story, he Reuben's not the leader of the Torah, and the Torah wants us to know that Reuben is not the leader. And so, Datan and Aviram have been passed over. Right? They're of the children who've been passed over. Right? And clearly that is the angle that is being taken by Chazal, by the rabbis, that there's something there's something Salieri-esque going on here, right? There's something, who got, really Mozart? What about me? You see F. Murray Abraham, so, okay, so look at the Ramban. Look at Ramban, the next source, Nachmanides. Yeah, do you see Ramban, Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman, the great 13th century Spanish Kabbalist and commentator? He has a really interesting take on what's happening here. You see it? Korach Tok. V'nachon b'derech b'drash sheka'as Korach al nisiut al safan k'ma'amar rabotenu. The real reason for Korach's rebellion is as explained in the Midrash Rabbah and in the Midrash Tanchuma, two compendia of Midrash material, of folk material. Korach was angry. He was also envious of Aaron, as it says, and yet you asked to be Kohanim as well in verse 10. Datan and Aviram did not join with Korach for the same reason. It was not Moshe who took away the right of the firstborn from the tribe of Reuven, for it was their forefather Yaakov who took it away from Reuven and gave it to Yosef. Right? So do you think they held a grudge? Right? So they held a grudge. Rather, they stated their complaint, you brought us out of Egypt to kill us in the desert, even into a land flowing with milk and honey, you have not brought us. Korach was calculating, as long as the Bnei Yisrael were in the Sinai desert, no bad event occurred. For even the very severe sin of the golden calf resulted in relatively few deaths. The rest of the people were saved through Moshe's prayers, which lasted 40 days and 40 nights. And therefore, the nation loved Moshe with all of their soul and obeyed him. If someone would have rebelled at that time, he would have been stoned by the people. Therefore, Korach bided his time and refrained from reacting to Aaron's appointment as the Kohen Gadol. In the same way, the firstborn refrained from reacting to the elevation of the Levites and all of Moshe's actions. However, when they arrived in the Paran desert, many were burned in Tavera and died in Kivrot Ta'ava. There were, in other words, many more tragedies and unexpected horrible events took place. When they sinned with the spies in last week's Torah portion, Moshe did not succeed in annulling the decree with his prayer. And the leaders of the tribes died in a plague before Hashem. It was decreed upon the entire people to die in the wilderness. As a result, the people were embittered, and they began to feel that all their failures came as a result of Moshe's leadership. And Korach then saw his opportunity to dispute with Moshe, and he reasoned with the people would listen to him. And thus, this is the explanation of Datan and Aviram statement to kill us in the desert. They claimed, you have brought us into this place and you have not fulfilled the promise to bring us to a land flowing with milk and honey. You have not given us any inheritance at all. We will die in this desert and be annihilated here, and even our children will never leave this desert. For just as you have not fulfilled your promise to us, you will never fulfill your promise to our children. What does the Ramban add here in terms of the timing and therefore the motivation and the timing of this particular event? What is the opportunistic moment here that these quote unquote rebels with a cause, right, seize upon?
They see an opening.
They see an opening. What's the opening, Devorah?
Everyone's against Moshe, so now we can.
Now everyone's
Now we can
against
attack.
Moshe. In other words, we would have thought that after the spies in last week's Torah portion, no rebellion, because we saw what happens when some people rebel against Moshe's leadership or against God. Right? There's a promise, we're going to land. It's going to take a while. We can do it. Yes, we can. Barack Obama, it's okay. Yachon Mukhal, we're going to get there. Right? But instead, what does it actually open up for these opportunistic politicians? They have resentments that have been brooding. They should have been the Levite. They were from the tribe of Levi. Aaron, right, replaces them, and Korach's got a taina. Korach has a complaint. Why Aaron? Why not me? It's nepotism. And then we have the Reubenites who are saying, wait a second, we're the firstborn. You gave the firstborn status to Levite, but it wasn't the right moment. Why? Because Moshe's leadership was really solid. Because in every instance, Moshe had showed himself able to win over the populace with his powerful prayer moments, right? He was a great president because, everything was working. The people were he had a really high approval rating. Now is not the time to jump. And all of a sudden, after last week's Torah portion, where not only the rebels are put down, but everybody is going to now suffer the fate of not entering the land. Reuven, the children of Reuven, Datan and Abiram say, you see everybody? This is what you get when you follow Moshe. You know, he could pray up to a point, but now you're not going in. You're not going to make it into the land. We're not getting there. We're all going to die here in the wilderness. It's time for a regime change.
Do they know that it's another 40 years at this point? Is it
Yeah,
understood
it's
that
been
they have
decreed.
that?
Yeah, it was decreed. Exactly.
I think what
So they
makes
know they're
it
serving.
great.
They know they're serving a sentence. And so now there's a chink in the armor. There's an opening, and these guys step in. And instead of saying, right, something, making a legitimate complaint, they're saying, it's time for, we need a new leader, someone who can actually help us get to the promised land, because clearly Moshe's not the right guy. Right? And now comes the moment. Yeah, Jeff, you have to speak loud enough into the.
It's like stock market is up, the leader, everyone loves the leader. Stock market goes down, suddenly it's time for regime change. So, I mean, it's very, very natural for a population to only, the memory is short. For leadership, people care about what's in their own pocket, and as soon as their pocket is empty, suddenly it's all the fault of the president. I mean, it's the most natural way of being.
Right.
These people are doing.
Right, absolutely. But of course, it's not on them. It has nothing to do with them. It's Moshe's fault, right? So it's not because the people, like the very reason for what befalls them is because of their rebellion. And yet that's not the reason given. It's Moshe's ego. Moshe has been lording it over them. And so they have to attack Moshe. It's an ad hominem.
So maybe this is the very first example of gaslighting history, especially with their use of the phrase milk and honey, right?
Oh, that's
milk and honey.
Yeah.
Egypt was milk and honey.
Right. So for those who don't know this, for those who don't know and maybe couldn't hear it because the microphone is over here, in the text.
Rabbi, I think you muted yourself. You muted yourself.
Hey, Rabbi David, and we can't hear you.
Okay. So let's go back to the beginning of the class.
Sorry,
so let's
Rabbi
start,
David. It's somehow muted there. Could you potentially just summarize what you just said? Yeah.
It's still muted?
We're good now. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I don't even know where we got lost there, but I think that we were saying that Ray was saying that one of the moments of gaslighting that is most ridiculous in the Torah, I mean, there are many. Like they're imagining that they were back in the land of watermelon and gourds and delicious meat. But here, yeah, but they call the land of milk and honey. Egypt becomes the land of milk and honey in their retrospective here, and that's so clearly ridiculous. But nonetheless, right, their claim is not against Moshe's leadership per se. It's about Moshe elevating himself. Right? They don't say that Moshe is ineffectual because his prayers, but in the Ramban's reading, this is a really calculated moment. They were biding their time. Right? They're biding their time. Okay. Now, okay, go ahead, Amy. And if you could, yeah, Amy.
Yeah, hi. I tend to look at the Torah timeline not as a straight line, but as a spiraling up to down to what's occurring in the Torah all the way up to us. And if you look at the parallels, Korach was found Joseph's treasure. And he was at the time, I guess maybe still, the richest man who ever lived. And yet he went down burning with 250 people. So now you have come up to our time, you have Elon Musk, who's the richest man who ever lived, who is alive today. And he has gone down in flames with his cars being set on fire. And if you look at the 250, because of his actions, he has killed well over 250,000 poor children through his actions. So there is
Okay,
that
Amy,
great parallel between the two.
yeah, thank you, Amy. I got to cut you off right there because I want to make sure that we get to the Midrash. But yeah, I think it's important to try to refract the Torah into the present moment for sure. That's a fascinating Midrash that he was as wealthy that he had found Joseph's treasure. Interesting Midrash. Let's look at a different series of Midrashim now from Korach. I wanted to pivot into the rabbis' deepening of the motive of Korach's motivation, or let's put it this way, Korach's argument, because it's a very odd argument. Like the way that the rabbis construct. So let's time out. So we don't know anything about what Korach was doing in the back, like behind the scenes, right? In his. There's no reason to believe that there is anything more than the way that the Torah presents the story of Korach. There's no reason. But of course, Midrash is never satisfied with what's on the page. It wants to tell us things that it imagined was happening behind the scenes in the white space before the black letters, between the black letters, above them, below them, all around them. That's the role of Midrash, is to kind of offer its own take. And there's a fascinating tradition that says that there are connections between last week's Torah portion's ending and the beginning of this week's Torah portion. How did last week's Torah portion end? So the Torah portion last week, which dealt with the eyes of the spies, the spies, that their eyes were led astray. And in response to that, the Torah gives us the commandment of tzitzit, of fringes, right? The little tassels, the beautiful, the divine curls, as it were, the tzitziot that are hanging thread-like from the corners of four-cornered garments, are in direct response, linguistically, thematically, with the spies, right? The spies are the ones who are led astray by their eyes, and then we're not to be led astray by the eyes. And the tzitzit have a unique commandment within them. Not only do we have to have tzitzit, or these tassels on the four corners, but we have to put a blue thread called techelet into the tzitzit, right? One of the four threads has to be a blue thread called a patil, techelet. A patil techelet, a thread of blue. Now, that becomes the backdrop, the pretext for a beautiful and wild midrash that tries to deepen some of the argument of Korach about Moshe's leadership and signal that he himself is the leader that the Jewish people should follow. Right? So that's the context for the midrash. Okay, it's all about the tchelet. And in this midrash, you'll see that Korach fancied himself not only questioning Moshe's authority, but Moshe's, let's say, halachic or commander-in-chief or obligator-in-chief authority, right? He kind of challenges Moshe's intellectual and Torahitic knowledge, okay? That's the way that he's going to win over the people in the minds of the rabbis. But it has something interesting in it. So let's look at this question. Now Korach. See it? Vayikach Korach. See it? Bamidbar Rabbah 18:3. Thank you so much, Caroline. Now Korach took what is written at the end of the Torah portion that comes before the Korach story, right? That's the question of the Midrash. The Jewish people learned how to do the mitzvah of tzitzit, right? Speak unto the children of Israel and tell them to make tassels for themselves. That's a quote from the third paragraph of the Shema, what we call the third paragraph of the Shema, which is in the book of Numbers in Shlach. Korach quickly said to Moshe, with the mob behind him, right? So the people, this is like a showdown at the OK Corral, right? There's Moshe. There's going to be like a wrap off, like Eminem. There's going to be a commandment off. There's going to be a Torah off, right? You see them facing each other. It's like spaghetti western style, right? Right. Clint Eastwood and whoever's playing. So here he goes. He says to him, Amalakar, talit shekula tcheles. If you have a talit that is all made of blue thread, right? The whole thing is blue thread. What is the rule about it being exempt from having the tassels? Does it need, is it now patur? Does it need, do we still need the tassels? Do we, like, it's a crazy question. Then he says, let me give you another, okay, so Moshe says to him, such a prayer shawl is required to have tassels, right? It still needs tassels, still needs titiyot. He says, okay. What if you have a house full of books? Does it still need a mezuzah? Okay, he says, no, it needs a mezuzah. Amar lo, kol haTorah kula matzayim b'shivim v'chamesh parshos eina poteres habayis parsha achas shebemezuzah poteres habayis. So he says to him, wait a second. If I have a house full of, like, all of the parshiot, it's tons of Torah in the house. And if that's not enough to make the house sufficiently full of Torah, now I put I put one little mezuzah on the door and that it's okay? Just like it doesn't make any sense. This is a line of reasoning that the rabbis are imagining Korach is now undermining Moshe's authority in some way. System. So Moshe said to him, such a house is required to have a mezuzah. Korach said, since the whole Torah has 275 parshiot in it, and they do not exempt the mezuzah, the house, from having a mezuzah, would one parsha, right, in the mezuzah exempt the house? He said to him, these are things about which you have not been commanded. Rather, you are inventing them by taking them out of your own heart. In other words, Moshe says back to him, this is not something that we should be adjudicating. You're making this whole thing up, right? You're just using it as a pretense to attack me. Being sophisticated, but right? Korach took. This is where he took it from his own heart. That's what it means that he took. He didn't take the men in this midrash. What he took is he took to his heart to try to create and fabricate examples that would fluster Moshe. He's using sophistry in order to undermine Moshe's authority, right? To undermine, right, and to poke holes. He was using sophisticated words and language. He was obfuscating something clear, right? Something that was clear. Now, I'm going to stop here because it's a very, very long midrash. It goes for 2 pages. We don't have to go through the whole thing. What is at the heart of this midrashic, right, investigation of Korach's character? What is at the heart of this? You know what? I feel badly. Before I do, let's do the whole midrash. I feel like we can read it. It's not going to kill us. Let's read the whole thing, okay? It'll take a little bit of time, but we have to read it through, and we'll get a better flavor.
Can I just clarify something before?
Yes, absolutely.
This idea that he took, so the idea is that what he took is the previous parsha, and now they're doing open book study together.
Right. It's that, or he was taken. His heart took him away. His heart took him, or he was taken by his own. He tried to take with words, because sometimes taking is connected to words in the rabbinic tradition. That he took words and he made something clear into something unclear.
Okay.
It could also be, as you'll see in a second, that his heart took him and he took his heart and then, right, used it in a way to create a reality that created instability. Okay. He destabilized an already unstable community with his own heart's comments, like he was trying to take them, to acquire them in some way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So look in the middle of I'm so sorry, there are no, the page numbers were clearly not there. I put them in, but they didn't come out. If you look on, I guess, if you go back to the beginning of this midrash and just go to the very next page, just turn the page. And in the middle of the page, you'll see it says, here is what it is written in Numbers 16:1. You see that? Here is what is written in Numbers 16:1. Now Korach took. Now took can only be a word of discord, and that his heart carried him away, lakach. Thus the word is used in Job, how your heart was carried you away. You are so taken with yourselves. You are taken with yourself. In other words, the word to take here becomes used in English. You'd say you are taken by yourself. You are taken by your own argument. You are taken by. This explains what Moshe said to them. Is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has given you a unique job and set you apart for a holy task to carry the ark and helped to perform the service. The sages have said Korach was a great sage and was one of the bearers, right, of the ark. Korach was a very important person. It wasn't that he wasn't important. But to the children of Kohat, he gave no wagons because they had the service of the holy objects which they carried on their shoulders. In other words, the very first verse of this parsha says that he's from the family of Kohat. Kohat are the ones who carry the ark on their shoulders. You carry the ark. You're like an important macher. You set out the kiddush. You're the guy. You're the gaba. You're the senator. You're the congressman. You're important. But you want more? You're taken. Korach was the son of Yitzhar, was the son of Kohat. When Moshe said, and put on the tassel of each corner a thread of blue, what did Korach do? He immediately ordered them to make 250 blue shawls for those 250 heads of the Sanhedrin, the courts, who rose up against Moshe to wrap themselves in, just as it is stated, and they rose up against Moshe together with 250 men from the children of Israel, princes of the congregation chosen in the assembly. Korach arose and made them a banquet at which they all wrapped themselves in blue prayer shawls. And when Aaron's sons came to receive their dues, namely the breast and the right thigh, where they came to receive their gifts, they rose against them and said to them, who commanded you to receive these things? Was it not Moshe? If so, we shall not give you anything, as the Holy One, blessed be, has not commanded it. They came and informed Moshe. He went to placate them, and they immediately confronted him, as it is stated, and they rose up against Moshe. And who were they? Elitzur ben Shedeur and his companions, the princes, the men who were mentioned by name. Although the text does not publicize their names, it has provided clues to their identity, allowing you to identify them from various verses. A parable. To what is the matter comparable? To a scion of good parentage who stole articles from the bathhouse. The owner of what was stolen did not want to publish the name. Rather, he began to give clues about the identity. When they said to him, who stole your articles? He said, a sign of a good parentage, a tall person with beautiful teeth and black hair. And after he had given his clues, they knew who he was. So also here the text has concealed them and not specified their names, but it comes and gives you clues to their identity. You know who they are, as it is stated elsewhere. They were elected by the congregation, princes of their ancestral tribes, heads of thousands within Israel. And so Moshe, wow, it's a long midrash, sorry. And so Moshe and Aaron took these men who were mentioned by name. Now here it is written, princes of the congregation elected by the assemblymen of renown, they gathered together against Moshe and Aaron. So the midrash is making a claim. 250 garments made of pure blue. They were dressed to kill. They were dressed to confuse. It was like they were wearing the garments of rebellion. We wear the garments of a world in which everything is blue. And as a statement against Moshe, Moshe is so incompetent, he doesn't know the right answer, that it's so obvious to all of us. Anybody would know that if you have to put one thread of blue on tzitzis, if you put a whole garment made of tchelet, then you don't need tzitziot, you don't need tassels, right? That's all you need is tchelet. Like, let's improve on it. Moshe said this, let's make it better. And so how is the framing here of Korach and his rebellion? Let's start with Jake. Go ahead.
I find it ironic and interesting, and to me comforting, that it would seem that the Mefarshim here are really arguing the ultimate supremacy of the Pshat.
Yes, very ironic. Okay, so with that, let's look at the last source that I brought from Rav Soloveitchik to see how this has been read. The last source before we come back to Beth's point that was made earlier about the possible positive spin on Korach. So look at the source from Rav Soloveitchik, who was the great modern Orthodox sage of the 20th century, really the greatest halachic authority in the modern Orthodox world, the centrist Orthodox world, Yeshiva University, Lithuanian Talmudist of the highest regard, philosopher, who reads this midrash. If you just take Jay's point, here the rabbis are essentially saying that Korach's rebellion is, you can read it as Jay said, which is the rabbis seem to be pointing to the pshat of the text, the simple meaning of the text, and in some sense problematizing Korach's desire to embellish the text or to veer from the text. But the Rav sees it slightly differently, and we might, right, just reading this through the lens of the Rav and through halacha, you might see something else. And see, I want to hear where this lands for you as well. And then we'll end with a Hasidic Torah, which very much undergirds what Beth was saying. The Rav elaborates on both of these points in his article, The Common Sense Rebellion Against Torah Authority. Korach thought that mitzvot were based on common sense. What would wearing an entire garment of tchelet not fulfill? Why would the wearing an entire garment of tchelet not fulfill the mitzvah if a pair of tzitzit with just one tchelet strand does? Since Korach perceived mitzvot as being based on common sense, he therefore declared that all rational people have the right to interpret Jewish law according to their best understanding. There's no need for gedolim, for great ones of Torah authorities, since we could all be our own authority by just using common sense. Korach's approach is problematic, for it fails to understand the relationship between knowledge, chokhmah, and dat, intelligence, in Judaism. The Rav writes, this is Rav Soloveitchik, Korach's appeal to common sense in Judaism was basically a claim that only dat and not chokhmah is involved in the application of Jewish law, of halakha. The halachic legal system, as a chokhmah, as a branch of wisdom, has its own methodology, its own mode of analysis, conceptualized rationale, even as do mathematics and physics. The oral law has its own epistemological approach, which can be understood only by a scholar, a lamdan, who has mastered its methodology and its abundant material. Just as mathematics is more than a group of equations and physics is more than a collection of natural laws, so too halakha is more than a compilation of religious laws. It has its own logos and method of thinking and is an autonomous, self-integrated system. The halakha need not make common sense any more than mathematics and scientific conceptualized systems need to accommodate themselves to common sense. The Rav, and this is a commentator on this piece from the Rav, notes that Korach's rebellion was not quelled when he and his followers were swallowed by the ground as punishment for their actions. The common sense argument that was the rallying cry of Korach's rebellion is still alive today. He explains that some people believe they can use their own common sense to decide the relevance and format of contemporary Judaism. They admit they don't have formal training in Jewish texts and sources, yet, like Korach, they still insist they have the right to decide major religious questions by exercising common sense, eliminating the need for religious authorities. They leave science to scientists and math to mathematicians, but they refuse to leave halakha to halachic experts. So I thought that was really interesting, given what Jay was saying about the irony of the rabbis framing him as someone, right, who came with a halachic argument. And the rabbis were essentially, as Jay said, saying, well, the text is the text. But I want to just slightly amend what you were saying, Jay, because I think in the mind of Rav Soloveitchik, I know I see your hand, in the mind of Rav Soloveitchik, and I think the more accurate read, frankly, of the Midrash is not going back to the pshat of the text, but rather the rabbis are essentially arguing that the common sense argument of Korach is in distinction, or should be distinguished and in contrast to the methodology of Moshe, who was the authority, who had the clear methodological, like the inner understanding of how halakha works. And that is kind of, again, this is Rav Soloveitchik's reading. I'm not saying it's the truth, but it's an interesting different than, let's say, Jay. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, no, I love Rav Soloveitchik's reading, but I don't see it as contrary to my own, in the sense that if you use the mathematics, the essential proof are all proofs that rely on pshat. Ultimately, the methodology rests on being able to come back to pshat as the bedrock of a proof, even when there's commentary and other things. Ultimately, it relies on the fundament of pshat. And I think that's, to me, important to recognize.
Okay, great. So that's nice to ameliorate those two, to harmonize them. But like, before I'm going to open it up also to Rosh Chaim and then Beth and come back in the room. But I just want to say that in some way, you can read this, of course, as to some degree as that in the context of Rav Soloveitchik, who was writing at a time polemically in dialogue with conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism and Reconstructionist and all of the non-Orthodox movements within America. One can read this as a critique more broadly of American Jewish denominationalism, which I think is accurate. But it also is a critique, though, of a phenomenon that all of us have witnessed over the last decade, which is the erosion of and the derision of expertise. That we live at a time where the democratization of knowledge has led to the point where we have the head of, the director of our entire nation's medical system is someone who has a derision for expertise. We see expertise, right, is the Korachian rebellion against expertise as understood by Rav Soloveitchik within the narrow space of Judaism is a much broader critique that we can, it's not such a big stretch, like, hey, wait a second, like, shouldn't we just let vaccine be, like the question of vaccine should just be moderated by Facebook likes, and like, let's just decide on science based upon, like, there is a legitimate suspicion of the institutionalized world of medicine, the institutionalized world of health, and some of those things are legitimately, right, have critiques, just like even, those within halakha have critiques of certain arguments or certain, right, ossifications. But like the more broad critique here is really, it hits home in such a big way. So I'm going to stop Asher Chaim, Beth in this order, and then I think Thomas has his hand, and then Ray. Go ahead, those four. Asher Chaim, Baruch haba.
Thank you, Rav, and Yasher Koach. First, just a snarky remark about Jay Yair, and going back to the pshat. The pshat is black letters on white parchment, incomprehensible without a tradition of how to read them and vocalize them, let alone exactly what the Torah text means on its own terms. As a rabbinic Jew rather than a Karaite, I have to take my pshat with a little bit of tradition. But my main comment, when I saw from the Rav, Korach's rebellion was not quelled when he and his followers were swallowed by the ground as punishment for their actions. That led me to the second resolution, the immediate resolution of the Korach revolt later in the Parsha, is not when the rebels are destroyed, because the people's sympathy is immediately, instinctively with the victims who have been killed. Rather, the revolt ends with a test that Aaron's rod can flourish as a sign that the Aaronide priesthood is more legitimate, not because of massive overwhelming force, but when the people see a sign of new life and new hope and new flourishing, that's what stabilizes us. And that perhaps is the other big takeaway for these days and our scorched earth policies of Facebook attacks rather than trying to make things grow and flourish. Thank you for the soapbox, Dibarti.
Yeah, Shamati, I just want to say that I don't like the binary that you set up, although I love the beauty of what you got to. I would argue that if we're going to use the Torah as some guide to what helps, both of these steps are necessary. Like had the rebels remained, they might have spun that proof as well in a direction that would have undermined its authority, right? So, had it been sufficient for just the almond to to sprout forth from Aaron's staff, without also the eradication of those who could not be, whose ideology would have spun that away from its direct evidence of Aaron's power and Aaron's legitimacy, then perhaps we would have a completely different story. So maybe we need both of them on whatever metaphorical level, whatever that means exactly. So thanks, Beth. Thanks, Esher Chaim. Always fruitful. Beth.
I'm retired from a long career in science, and I just wanted to say that common sense goes a very long way indeed, depending on the particular area of science you're talking about. Um, However, when you get into mathematics, that's when you get into some really counterintuitive stuff that doesn't make sense to, what I would call regular people like me. Having been a math major at one time, and third year calculus starts becoming counterintuitive, and that's where I checked out of it. Um, but with regard to democratization of opinion, we do not have democratization of science education. We just don't. People, at least here in the United States where I am, are amazingly scientifically illiterate. And so, I would take any opinions that are offered in the face of that illiteracy with a bag of salt. DeBerti.
Yeah, a bag of salt we should hand out for sure. My kids were pointing out last night that now challahs, you can buy a challah in the Jewish bakery or in the in the gourmet store, and it comes with a little bag of salt. So make sure that you put salt. So take our challah with a whole bag of salt would be a good idea. Okay, in the room, Tomas, and then I think Ray and okay, go ahead, Tomas.
Just a bit of a left field observation, wildly associative. Thinking about the fact that these rebels are unnamed and the idea of naming and making a distinction by naming. And then strangely, the color blue, which is a fact that I just learned this week and can't resist sharing, that in the kind of so-called Indo-European language, of which both English and Hebrew are cousins, the color blue is famously the last color to come into any language. In the names that we have for colors. And so, for example, in contemporary texts to this one in the 12th or 13th century BC, like in the Odyssey, the great Greek saga of seafaring, the color blue is not mentioned once. And you think, oh, the sea, the sky, come on, it was a blue world. But they never used the word. And similarly in ancient Egypt, the word was missing. They called the river black and they called the Mediterranean green. Their word for the Mediterranean was the Great Green. These historians of language are really excited for exactly these parshas because they're some of the earliest historiographical evidence of the word blue that we have. And the theories of language and the theories of thinking state that actually being able to name a color precedes your ability to see it. Blue, what we call blue, actually very rare in nature, like certain birds, certain fruits, and the name for the color of the sky is just sky. And so just to add on to this idea of expertise versus common knowledge.
What is the theory as to why blue was unnamed?
Because the color that we now call blue, there's two aspects to the theory of the unnamed. The first is that the color that we now call blue in the natural world is rare as a single blue thread in a field of white. Certain berries, certain birds, it's actually an uncommon color. We love it, we've made it common through science. The second is that cognitively, in theories of the mind, in theories of language, the name precedes the phenomenon. In order to recognize the phenomenon, we must first have the name. This is deeply counterintuitive. Like we see something like Adam and we name the animal. But this actually, it's a neurological theory that the name precedes your ability to recognize the named. And your recognition of the named precedes your ability to make that thing. So first you have the name blue and you're like, what's blue? And there's a theory that this text, blue, actually preceded what we now call blue. So at some point, some proto-rabbis had to get together and say, okay, it's blue, what the hell is blue? We have to decide. And I love the idea that naming precedes seeing and seeing precedes making. It's so backwards that it's forwards again. It just feels right to me. And then just a matter of distinction. If everything is blue, then nothing is blue. And it is this matter of the finest possible thread, the finest possible distinction. But I love this idea that they had the name first and they had to decide what it was in order to make it, in order to fulfill a commandment. And I think that applies to a discourse of expertise and of science, and also to maybe more mystical things about the nature of naming and the naming of nature.
And extending it into the conversation, the context of this in terms of community, right? The sense that what is at play here is universalism and particularism.
Yes.
And what's at play, of course, is individual and collective, and the all and the one is all that's happening here in some profound way. And the Anshe Shem are men of name, but here it could also be, right, men who are obsessed with names and naming things and knowing things. And like there is, like the question at play in Korach's story is, if the world is flattened, does it then also revert back to individuality into something particular, or does it remain flattened in some way? And what's the role of that, right? Is that important, right? If everything is blue, then is it important, what are the role of individual colors, and does it matter? So all that was great. I know we have a lot to talk about. Ray, you had last point quickly, because I want to do this last X, and we have 4 minutes.
We have to go down.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say quickly, I'm blown away by last week's story and this story on an allegorical level, because I just found that the Torah, to me, my little gloss, is giving us a very, very powerful lesson here about the karmic consequences of lack of faith, lack of belief, like in last week's parsha when the community was saying, get us out of here, all the murmuring, and the opportunistic cynicism of Korach and his leaders in this parsha.
Absolutely.
And they both are, he says, you're going to all die in the desert, and he swallows them whole. And I think the Torah is giving us a very powerful lesson here about the karmic consequences of lack of faith and opportunism.